If you ever rent a cabin deep in the woods, do one thing before you unpack: check the attic. I didn't do that. I had just gone through a rough breakup and wanted a few days of total silence. No phone calls, no social media, and absolutely no people. The listing was a tiny wooden cabin outside Kalispell, Montana. Looking at these mountains, you can see why it felt perfect. The nearest neighbor was more than 2 miles away, buried somewhere in those trees. Everything seemed normal when I arrived. It was a 4-hour drive, and the owner just left the key in a lockbox. Inside, it was exactly what I paid for: a stone fireplace, 1 small bedroom, and a tiny kitchen, quiet enough that you could hear the wind moving through the pines. That first night, I woke up at 2:30 a.m. to a sound above me. Not outside on the roof, but heavy, deliberate footsteps walking slowly across the ceiling, directly over my bed. I stayed perfectly still in the dark. After 30 seconds, the pacing stopped, and I spent the rest of the night convincing myself the house was just settling. It's exactly what you do when you're completely alone. You find a perfectly normal reason for the things that scare you. The next morning, it was easy to forget the noise. I spent the day hiking through the surrounding woods. But looking at how thick these trees are, it's clear how easily someone could watch the cabin without ever being seen. When I got back just before sunset, I noticed the kitchen chair. I usually leave it tucked against the table, but now it was pulled out, facing the window. I didn't remember moving it, but when you're by yourself for days, you start to doubt your own memory. I told myself I must have sat there and simply forgotten. Then the second night came. The footsteps returned, pacing back and forth for much longer this time. I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside to catch whatever animal was on the roof, but the shingles were empty. The moment I stepped back inside, the noise stopped. By the next morning, the mystery became physical. I found my loaf of bread on the kitchen counter. The bag was sealed, but 2 slices were missing. I hadn't eaten any. That's when I saw them. On the plastic bag, there were clear, muddy fingerprints. They weren't mine. You can't blame a settling house for a muddy thumbprint. Seeing those marks on my food changed everything. Someone had been standing in that kitchen with me. I drove into town for groceries just to get away, but when I returned, the porch light I'd left off was glowing, and as soon as I stepped through the door, the air smelled like cigarette smoke. I grabbed a fireplace poker and searched every room. Then I looked up. In the hallway, there was a narrow wooden ladder leading to an attic hatch. It blended into the ceiling so well I hadn't noticed it before. Now it was resting open by about an inch. I climbed the ladder slowly. The attic was a cramped crawl space filled with insulation and old beams. I swept my flashlight through the dark, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the light steady. The beam landed on a sleeping bag tucked into the corner. Around it were empty food cans, plastic water bottles, and an old backpack. Someone had been living in this space, just feet above where I slept. I scrambled down the ladder and ran for my car. As I reached the door, I looked back up at the roof. A face appeared behind the attic vent for a split second before disappearing into the house. There is a specific kind of horror in realizing that your locks and walls didn't matter. The threat wasn't trying to get in. It was already there, watching from inside the one place you thought you were safe. The police arrived 20 minutes later, but the attic was already empty. The sleeping bag, the food, the backpack, it had all been cleared out in minutes.
The only thing they found was a single coffee mug that didn't belong to the cabin. 2 weeks later, a detective called with the results from the bread bag. They hadn't found a local squatter. They found a match in a missing persons database. The prints belonged to a man who had vanished 8 years earlier. This map shows the cabin, and this radius marks the 10-mile zone where he disappeared. 8 years passed. His body was never found. He hadn't left the mountain. He simply survived in the forest shadows, and eventually in that cabin's ceiling. The cabin is still for rent today under a new owner. If you look up the listing, the reviews are almost all positive, but they share a recurring detail. Guests keep mentioning the place is beautiful, but every night it sounds like someone is walking on the roof. We tend to trust the convenience of a 5-star rating and a clean interior, but every rental has spaces we don't check. If you hear something in the walls, Don't wait for the evidence to become physical. Trust your gut. If you look at this dashcam footage, you'll see a physical anomaly that defies basic gravity. The rear seat cushion slowly depresses. Deep indentations form in the fabric. A physical weight of roughly 180 pounds settles in, but the seat is completely empty. A moment later, the camera's microphone picked up the ambient sound of rain hitting the windshield, followed by a clear, calm male voice saying, "Just keep driving." Yet no one ever appeared on the video. This diagram compares the driver's local app data with the rideshare company's central servers. The left side shows an active, high-paying trip requested by a user named Daniel, but the right side reveals a massive void. The central network recorded no booking, no user profile, and 0 GPS tracking data for that time window. In fact, according to the rideshare company's official logs, the driver's application had completely disconnected from the network 37 minutes before they even pulled up to the location. We are left with two sets of facts that cannot coexist. A localized physical event left actual indentations on a seat and audio on a hard drive, while the centralized digital network insists the car was empty and offline the entire time. The sequence of errors started at the end of a long late-night shift in Chicago. It was a cold, rainy October night. The driver was about to log off when a high-paying fare directed them to an old church parking lot on the edge of town. The passenger's profile was minimal, a 5-star rating and a single name, Daniel. There was no profile picture attached to the account. After pulling into the deserted lot, the driver waited. No one approached in the rain. Then the rear passenger door opened. 1 second, the back seat was empty, and the next, a man was sitting directly behind the driver. The man wore a dark jacket, and his hair was completely soaked from the heavy downpour. Yet, oddly, not a single drop of water transferred to the car's upholstery. The fabric remained entirely dry. At 3 in the morning, human brains look for the path of least resistance. The driver chalked the weirdness up to sheer exhaustion, entirely ignoring the mounting physical impossibilities sitting inches behind them. As the route took them out of the city limits, the streetlights vanished. The heavy rain dropped visibility to near zero, forcing total reliance on the dashboard instruments to navigate the pitch-black roads. Then the environment began to fracture. When lightning struck, the driver glanced at the rearview mirror and saw a completely empty back seat. But when they physically turned their head to look over their shoulder, the passenger was still sitting right there. Shortly after, the cellular signal dropped and the navigation map froze. Before the driver could reach for the screen, the passenger spoke in a calm, flat tone, telling them not to worry, they wouldn't need the GPS. A minute later, the passenger instructed the driver to slow down. The driver hit the brakes. Almost immediately, a deer sprinted across the dark road, narrowly missing the bumper. In that heavy rain, no human eye could have seen it coming. When the GPS finally reconnected, it led them to a small white house in an older residential neighborhood. The property had no lights, no mailbox, and looked completely abandoned. The passenger stepped out. He leaned back toward the window, offered a highly unnatural, forced smile, and then walked behind the structure. He never reappeared. Over the course of a 30-minute drive, this entity bypassed cellular networks, anticipated unpredictable physical hazards, and operated completely outside the normal rules of light and reflection. The ride ended automatically on the app. 20 minutes later, the driver stopped for coffee at a gas station and mentioned the strange drop-off location to the cashier on duty. The cashier recognized the address immediately because he grew up just 2 streets over. But he pointed out a major problem. That specific white house had burned to the ground 12 years ago. Looking at this satellite map of the address, you can see exactly what the driver found on their phone that night. There is no house. It's just a rectangular patch of burnt dirt and weeds. The destination didn't exist. A month later, the driver tried to recover their deleted dashcam files to find answers. Every single mundane video from that night successfully restored, except for the exact 30-minute block of that specific ride. That data was permanently erased. The driver quit the app entirely and never told anyone the location of the initial pickup. And yet, every October, An anonymous, blank holiday card arrives in their mailbox. Inside the envelope is always a single printed photograph. It shows an old church parking lot at night, raining, taken directly from the perspective of someone sitting in the back seat of a car. We rely on GPS tracking, dash cams, and digital logs to provide a flawless record of reality. But when the data vanishes and the physical evidence remains, it forces us to consider the blind spots in our networks and what might be quietly writing in the back seat.